Heaven forbid no one ever again wants to be blamed for closing down non-essential government services. Only cruel and heartless constitutionalists would ever suggest such a politically foolish stunt. And it's not going to happen. 1997 has proven that what many have suspected, that reversing or arresting a welfare state cannot occur by a majority vote. With apparent wealth abundance in the United States, the reversal assuredly will not come with ease. Once redistribution of wealth is permitted by the Democratic vote, destruction of production will occur before the majority will choose to curtail their own benefits. The end is closer than most realize, considering the optimistic rhetoric coming from Washington, plus the fact the majority of citizens are beneficiary of the system, and even the producers have grown dependent on government protection, grants, contracts, and special subsidies. Although the session ended on a modestly happy bipartisan note, I suspect in time, 1997 will be looked upon as a sad year in that the limited government revolution of 1994 was declared lost by adjournment time in November. That does not mean the fight for liberty is over. But the hope that came by reversing congressional rule after 40 years has been dampened, and a lot more work is necessary for success. The real battle is to win the hearts and minds of Americans outside of Washington, to prepare the country for the day when the welfare state ceases to function due to an empty treasury and the dollar, not worth its weight, comes under attack. Specifics worth pondering. The budget for current fiscal year, 1998, calls for expenditures of $1.69 trillion, or $89 billion above last year. The 1997 budget was $22 billion over 96. The so-called balanced budget bragged about is to occur in the year 2002, with more cuts being made in the year 2001 and at a level of spending far above today's. The expenditures in the year 2002 are expected to increase to $1.9 trillion, over $200 billion more than this year. Increased revenues obviously accomplish the job of a theoretically balanced budget. But also, these projections do not take into account the huge sums borrowed from Social Security. Even if things go well and as planned, the optimism is based on deception, wishful thinking, and a huge rage on the Social Security and other trust funds. In spite of this, the politicians in Washington are eagerly planning on how to spend the coming budgetary surpluses. All these rosy projections are dependent on economic strength, steady low interest rates, and no supplemental appropriations. Every session of Congress gets supplementals, and if the economy takes a downturn, the higher the appropriation. The last 3 years aren't much to brag about. Domestic spending has gone up by $183 billion. In the prior 3 years, when Democrats controlled the Congress, spending increased by $155 billion. Tax increases are now inevitably referred to as revenue enhancement and closing of loopholes. In spite of some wonderful IRS bashing by nearly everyone and positive hearings in exposing the ruthless tactics of the IRS, Congress and the President saw fit to give the IRS a whopping $729 million increase in its budget, hoping the IRS will become more efficient in their collection process. Real spending cuts are not seriously considered. Congress continues to obfuscate by calling token cuts in previously proposed increases as budget cuts. And the media and the proponents of big government welfare obediently demagogue this issue by decrying why the slashes in the budget are inhumane and uncaring. Without honesty in language and budgeting, true reforms are impossible. In spite of the rhetoric, bold new educational and medical programs were started, setting the stage for massive new spending in the future. New programs always cost more than originally projected. The block grant approach to reform did not prompt a decrease in spending and frequently added to it. The principle of whether or not the federal government should even be involved in education, medicine, welfare, farming, etc., was not seriously considered. The 1998 budget is the largest ever and represents the biggest increase in the domestic budget in 8 years. Those in charge threw in the towel and surrendered all efforts this past year to cut back the size of government. And in this fiscal year, many can see the deficit will actually go up, even without a slowing in the economy. In this year's budget, Medicare and Medicaid increased 4 to 5 times the rate of inflation. This is not a complete surprise to the logical skeptics when it comes to fiscal matters, but it is just a little exasperating to hear the positive pronouncements of current leaders who just a few years ago would have been only too eager to point out the shortcomings of deceptive arithmetic. Power is a corrupting influence, but for now at least, a congressional power shift is not in the making. There are still a lot of recipients that are happily reassured that additional revenues can be found. The new management is welcomed, and it's hoped the new guys on the block can salvage for a while a system that many deep down in their hearts are convinced is not manageable for much longer. There is a sense of relief the welfare state has received a reprieve. One can almost hear the sigh amplified by hearing of the problems in the Southeast Asia countries with their currency and stock market problems, not realizing it's the U.S. taxpayers and the dollar that will be called upon for the bailout of this financial crisis. The great danger of all this is the false sense of economic security Congress feels that has prompted total abandonment of efforts to actually cut any spending, and with plans being laid for spending increases. The message is this: the politicians will never limit spending, but eventually the market will. It has already done so in Thailand, South Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. The international currency crisis. Congress lacks concern and understanding of the significance of the Asian currency crisis. Monetary policy has never excited many members of the Banking Committee, let alone other members of Congress. A handful of members do consistently complain to the chairman of the Federal Reserve, but inevitably it's to object to the high interest rates and not enough credit being available to either the poor or the rich beneficiaries of central bank credit largesse. The Southeast Asian currency and economic bailout will exceed $100 billion. We will be propping up these currencies by sending American taxpayers dollars, the same thing we did in Mexico in 1995. Multilateral efforts through the IMF, the World Bank, and other development banks are used, and in each one, the United States is the most generous donor. IMF bailouts, just as our military foreign intervention, are generally supported by the leadership of both parties. The establishment has firm control in these two areas, and who, out of ignorance or neglect, the Congress as a whole provides little resistance. When the stronger currencies, and in this case the dollar, props up a weaker currency, it is nothing more than an example of an international transfer payment that helps our banks and international corporate investors who have financial exposure in the country or the currency under attack. These bailouts will work to some degree until the dollar itself comes under attack. Our relatively strong economy and the current perceptions of undue dollar strength allows great leverage in this extremely expensive and risky bailout operation. The genius of it all is that Federal Reserve credit expansion and its off-budget budgeting permits these funds to be spent without oversight. IMF appropriations are not even counted toward the deficit, and credit expansion is under complete control of the Federal Reserve. Long term, the average American citizen suffers through higher interest rates, rising prices, recessions, and a lower standard of living, but the cause and effect is conveniently hidden from the public and the Congress. After the Mexican bailout, her citizens lost 50% of their purchasing power, a dramatic pay cut. Yet the great danger is that someday we will be forced to pay, possibly with a dollar crisis, that will make the Asian currency crisis look small in comparison. All currency crises are serious and usher in economic and political problems for the country involved, and since no one likes it, blame is generally misplaced. When the dollar comes under attack, since it's the reserve currency of the world, a much more serious crisis than we are currently witnessing in Asia will occur. Only a universal acceptance of a single worldwide commodity standard of money can prevent these periodic devaluations and disruptions in trade that are so prevalent today. The day before we adjourned the first session of the 105th Congress, the Banking Committee held hearings on the Asian currency crisis, but it was more of an attempt to reassure the financial community than to sort out the cause and to do something about it. Instead, the dollar was crowned king, and Greenspan promised stability. Our real interest rates, balance of payments, our current account deficit, and budgetary deficits were conveniently ignored because if they had been looked at seriously, it would have been recognized that the U.S. and the world faces a major financial crisis once the dollar can no longer be used to bail out the world financial system. Currency issues are serious and a much bigger problem than Congress realizes. Even the Fed has convinced itself that it is quite capable of managing our fiat currency and our financial markets through any crisis. The money managers are every bit as powerful as the Congress, which taxes and spends, but the Federal Reserve's actions are much less scrutinized. But when push comes to shove, the markets always win out. Interest rates are less than 1% in Japan, have not prompted borrowers to come forth nor bankers to lend. The proposed $25 billion injection by the Bank of Japan won't solve the problem either. Even central bankers can't push on a string. The sad part is that all these shenanigans will cause undue suffering to the innocent who lose their jobs, suffer from price inflation, and see their standard of living shrink. Eventually, everyone, though, is threatened by the political disruption that can ensue with a currency mishap. Our greatest concern should be for our loss of liberties that so often accompany currency crises. Congressional attitude toward monetary policy is not likely to change soon, so we can expect a lot more turmoil in the currency markets in the months ahead. Two special areas. Congress in the past year capitulated in the two significant areas, but by not only failing to cut spending, but massively increasing government's role in medicine and in education. House Republicans bragged that 7 out of 8 educational initiatives passed the House, many of them being quite expensive. Charter schools cost over $100 million. Funding for vouchers was increased. $3 billion was appropriated to extend student loans, and a new $210 million Reading and Excellence program was initiated. A program for high-tech training and one designed to help children with disabilities was also started. Clinton's new health care program for children was accepted by Congress, which will eventually cost billions and further centralize medical care in Washington, while quality of care is diminished. Billions of dollars increased in NIH, AIDS research, and preventative health care were also approved. The federal government has been involved in education and medicine more than in any other domestic area. This has caused the serious price inflection for these two services while undermining the quality and results in both. The more we spend, the higher the cost, the worse the service, and the greater the regulations. So what did Congress do to solve the problems in the past year? Even in this so-called age of cutting back and balanced budget, it expanded government precisely in the two areas that suffer the most from big government. This is strong evidence that we have not yet learned anything in the past 50 years, and the 1994 revolution hasn't yet changed things. We can expect more HMOs and PPO mismanagement, rationing medical service, and price control of all medical services. Shortages of quality health care and education will result. Devolution. Block grants are the popular vehicle to restore local control of the federal bureaucracy. The housing bill, the first major change to public housing since the Depression, did not cut spending but actually increased funding through the block grant system of devolving power to the states. A token effort similar to this was made in the early 1970s under Nixon called revenue sharing. It didn't work and was dropped. This new method won't work either. Whether the bureaucrats are in Washington or in the state capitals, it won't change the dynamics of public housing. Public ownership, whether managed locally or federally, cannot replace the benefits of private ownership. Besides, the block grant method of allocating funds does not eliminate the need to first collect the revenues nationally and politically distribute the funds to the various state entities. Strings will always be attached, no matter how many safeguards are written into the law. The process of devolution is an adjustment in management and doesn't deal with the philosophical question of whether or not the federal government or even the state governments ought to be involved. The high hopes that this process will alter the course of the welfare state will, I'm sure, be dashed after many more years of failures and dollars spent. There is essentially no serious consideration in Washington for abolishing agencies, let alone whole departments. If the funding for the pornographic NEA can't be cut, which agency of government should we expect to be? The devolution approach is not the proponents of big government's first choice, but it is acceptable to them. Early adjournment meant the call for more spending was satisfied, and the supporters of big government, in spite of the rhetoric, were content. Searching for a partisan issue, the minority was content with campaign reform and the questions surrounding illegal voting.